My name is Carmen, the oral historian at William & Mary. It's currently around 1:30 p.m. on June 12, 2017. I'm in Washington, D.C. at the NCTA office with Michael Powell. Can we start by talking about the date and place of your birth?
Sure. I was born March 23rd, 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama.
Great. And what years did you attend William & Mary?
I graduated high school in 1981 and attended William & Mary that fall through spring of 1985.
Wonderful. And before jumping into your time at William & Mary, will you tell me a little bit about where and how you were raised and what your family was like?
Sure. I was born, interestingly enough, in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, which was a pretty tumultuous year in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. Tumultuous for two reasons. One, my father had just deployed to Vietnam, so unfortunately he had left before I was born. And my mother had moved home to be with her parents since she was about to give birth, and her husband was gone. And so I was born in Birmingham while living with my grandparents, who were quite famous people in their own right. He was the principal of the major black high school in Birmingham in 1963. And my grandmother was a real pioneer. She was integrated the Girl Scouts back then as well. So it was a pretty heated period in that part of the world. That was the year the 16th Street Baptist Church exploded, killing 4 little girls who my mother knew very well. In fact, we were in church, me as an infant, and her with me 3 churches down when it exploded. So we were in the city, very close by. So that part of my upbringing is important on my mother's Birmingham side. My father is a child of Jamaican immigrants who more or less talked their way into the country to start a new life. And my grandmother used to say to give my children a better life than they would have had in a small island country. And so he was born and raised in the South Bronx in New York before meeting my parents. He was a bit of a screw-up as a student, he likes to say, but he ultimately found his love in ROTC in the military. And so he set out on a journey with my mother after they got married of a military life together, of which me and my sisters got to be on the train. And so a lot of our upbringing was moving across the country. I never say that with any displeasure. For us, it was adventurous. It was fun. A lot of people say that, oh, the American people this. I can honestly say we've truly lived out there amongst all variety of American people in small towns in Kentucky, in bigger communities in the Great West in Colorado, along the East Coast. So we had a ball growing up, meeting friends, and living the military brat life.
Yeah. Wow, yeah, it sounds like you had quite the, travel experience just even as a youth. So where did you find yourself in high school? Did you go to several high schools or was there one?
I was very lucky. Me and my sisters have different stories. We moved to Northern Virginia for my father to work in the Pentagon right about the time I was starting freshman year of high school. And so I was really lucky enough to attend the same high school for all 4 years, which is pretty unprecedented for a military kid. And I went to Lake Braddock Secondary School in Burke, Virginia. My sisters, who are both William & Mary graduates, though my sister Linda is 2 years younger than me, had to go to 4 high schools in 4 years, just to give you a contrast. And my sister Ann had a few moves as well, so kind of depend on where you fell in the pecking order. Right. And I think one of the reasons I ended up being interested in colleges in the area was this really was the closest thing to home base in our family, to be around Virginia or Northern Virginia, since he would often return to that area no matter what. Mm-hmm. So, we drew a big circle from Washington, D.C., and certainly William & Mary was inside that circle.
Great. So how did you narrow in and choose William & Mary out of the other schools within that circle?
I wish I had a very pedagogical, significantly structured way of going about it. It seems the kids do much more today than we did. To be honest, I had no idea The colleges my parents went to were not ones that I would have been interested in, nor would they have been interested in for me. So, I didn't come, I was the oldest. I didn't sort of come with any family predisposition. But I was involved in high school in theater, as a matter of fact, and I had just a good friend who was 2 years younger than me, 2 years older than me, and she had gone to William & Mary. And it sounded prestigious, it sounded romantic, it sounded beautiful, it sounded hard. So it quickly sort of got to the top of my, stretch school list. And I was also applying to the military academies that year, so I really wanted to know early whether it was fish or cut bait, and I applied early decision. And I have to say I was stunned when I got accepted sometime in late November, December. I'd never seen the school at that point. And so my dad decides to throw me in the station wagon. We're going to go down and visit the college, except for the date was December 26th, the day after Christmas, which is the worst time in the planet Earth to visit a university. Not one single person was around. We took no tours. We walked around. We looked in the window of locked buildings. And for some reason, with me, that's all it took. You just felt like I could see being here. And, we went through the rest of the year. But kind of the emotion I had with it being the first place they let me in and the best place to let me in, there I had it. I picked.
Yeah.
And there was never any ounce of regret about that choice.
Wonderful. So I guess your very first memory or experience of William & Mary would be peeking through locked doors or windows of the buildings. But what about when you first got there for your freshman year? What was your very first memory of getting to William & Mary?
First of all, you should have your first impression is the brochures you get. When today everything's online, but back then, you would have to send away. You'd write a letter and you'd be sent a packet. And believe it or not, those packets would make a big impression on you. What do the pictures look like? What does the narrative feel like? So that's the first impression. But when I showed up, I also went to William & Mary on an ROTC scholarship, so I had to show up on move-in day. My parents had moved again. Now they lived in Colorado. And we left my little Ford powder blue Pinto sitting in Virginia with my trunk that my mother insisted I have a big steamer trunk. And I flew back from Colorado by myself, 18, to Washington, got in my little car and drove to William & Mary by myself. So I had no parental departing tears or anything. I was on my own. And I remember pulling up to Yates and finding the room. My roommate was there. He was a football player. He looked big enough to carry the trunk. So he came out, helped me move in. I remember being excited that day. The campus was sort of full of energy. But the first thing I had to do is I had to go report to the ROTC department. And I remember having to find my way with a map over to what is today Blow Hall, what then was Blow Gym. And I just remember being nothing but excited. And then there's a sort of week before classes start where you're playing human bingo in your dorm and various things. But I found, number one, the student body, I found so friendly, caring, and it's just sort of instant friends. And in fact, to this day, people I met the first week are still good friends, including my wife, who I met the third day, 4 doors down in Yates. Now she's not even 4 doors down. She's just right there. It's interesting, to form bonds that quickly. I found the campus beautiful. I think it has a physical presence that sticks with you pretty quickly. You're at a college. This is the imagery of the ivy, an ivy-covered wall with ancient values. It just felt like that. When I was a freshman, they did not have convocation, which I wish they had. So it was sort of, orientation was kind of you running around and spending time with students. I hate to tell you, the drinking age was 18, so freshman orientation included plenty of various keg parties that you attended, and which I did. So my impressions were just of happiness. And given that my parents were so far away, I don't know why I felt very comfortable and at home. I didn't feel worried in any way.
That's fantastic. Just to be able to that far away from family and feel so comfortable so quickly. It's not everyone's story of going to college.
Yeah, and knowing, unlike when they were in Northern Virginia, I couldn't just, I think there's always a moment for freshmen where they're lonely or sad or hungry for home cooking or want their clothes cleaned or something. That was not going to be a ride away for me anymore. It was a plane ride away, which made it very difficult because, my parents weren't going to afford, you get to see them when Christmas came or Thanksgiving came. I can't remember I didn't go home for Thanksgiving. I went home for Christmas, so I was away. But the campus filled in. It filled in as brothers and sisters and parents and friends very quickly.
Sure. And
Yeah.
you got involved in a lot of things, as you said, the ROTC. I guess from the very get-go you were involved in ROTC. Why did you choose to get involved or apply on an ROTC scholarship?
So, funny story is like, when I was applying to college, I had two completely irreconcilable ambitions. One was I wanted to be an Army officer like my father. And so I was applying to West Point and the Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy and for ROTC scholarships. And my other ambition was I was going to be a Broadway lighting designer. So I remember we would take these college tours up north and we would go to some theater school and then we'd go to West Point. Then we go somewhere else and we go to Annapolis. And my parents didn't care. They were sort of very, it's up to you. There's no... But at the end of the day, I kept looking for a compromise, and in some ways it made sense when I got a scholarship because, number one, the scholarship relieved a lot of the pressure of free school at West Point. Right now, college would be relatively inexpensive for my parents and for me. Secondly, William & Mary at the time had a pretty robust ROTC unit, so it was a pretty meaningful program. And it was a campus that had theater and other things. My theory was I could experience a lot more without having to make a commitment at 18 for a life of service at an academy that I wasn't ready to make. So that's kind of what made that choice. ROTC for me at the beginning was a lot like a fraternity would be, a common collection of people who, were pursuing the same things, many of whom I went through school with and got commissioned with and saw in the Army, so it was great.
That's great.
Yeah.
And you did end up joining a fraternity as well, yes?
I did, with absolutely no desire or expectation to do so when I went there. My parents were not Greek, either one, so I never even heard of these things in any real way. And, the little bit I knew from Animal House, I had no interest. But, what I think often happens, a lot of the guys on my hall were interested in Rush, and at the time, Rush was pretty civilized. And so I would go, and the fraternities were very open. You could come to them for parties and events, even if you weren't a member of them, and even if you weren't rushing. So, I ended up going because my roommates and hallmates were going. And I remember our RA at the time was a member of, or was also rushing a fraternity, even though he was a sophomore. So I kind of got swept into it, and then I just very quickly found a bunch of guys that I really liked. And, one thing led to another. Next thing you know, they're sort of offering you. I remember calling home like, is this okay? And they were fine. And so I joined, and I have to say, it was also a spectacular experience. I mean, the 4 years I was there, the students were, they were great men, and they were great friends, and they were, they were good citizens, and they had a lot of fun, like you want them to, but our house was very open to all students. And I became president of the fraternity by the time I was a senior, and even went on to be a national officer in the fraternity in the United States, was one of the 5 elected officials to the Theta Delta Chi fraternity. So it was a big part of my life too.
Yeah. And I was reading in Flat Hats, and I noticed that at that time, there was the transition, I guess, from the Interfraternity Council, perhaps when you were president, to a kind of newer version, a newer committee, and you were part of that transition, or you weighed in on that transition?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I have a little bit of a fuzzy memory of how the interfraternal governance worked. I mean, we did have the IFC, and when I was an officer, I was more cognizant of it. My junior and guess I was an officer, sophomore, junior, and senior, but vice president my junior year, and then president my senior year. And I was an active participant in that. And at that point, I had formed pretty important working relationships with campus administrators. I was a president's aide, so I got to know the president, was involved in the presidential search that led to the selection of Paul Verkyle. I remember being part of that. I had become well connected with Dean Sadler, who was then Dean of Students, later Vice President of Student Affairs. So I had a much more working knowledge, and so was often involved in task forces and projects to improve the school in different ways.
Sure. And I do have a question also. I noticed in the Flat Hats, and this was somewhat happening outside of the fraternities, but I think in some way included them as well. I noticed that at the time there were a lot of claims of sexual assaults, and this was something that was of growing concern at the school, and they were happening kind of outside the school's bounds. But I also saw in Flat Hats that this was something fraternities were also becoming increasingly cognizant of. And do you remember those conversations happening within the walls of the fraternity?
Yes, although look, I personally believe we've come a long way. I mean, it would be inaccurate to say in that period of the 80s, those conversations came with the same kind of consciousness, diligence, and seriousness, and commitment that they do today. I think campuses have come a long way on this, even though they probably still have a long way to go. And it would be unfair to say there were more casual attitudes about this, but I think the society and the culture was still struggling to get this right. I don't really remember any significant events that I had any direct knowledge of, friends or anything of that regard, though you would frequently hear about an incident, particularly at a fraternity. I will say, and I think it's just the luck of the draw, in the years I was a president of a fraternity, I think the fraternity was composed of guys who were quite conscious and committed to not tolerating that sort of stuff. Meaning, I even remember quite clearly, particularly if you remember, drinking ages were younger. So very common, during freshman orientation, here comes a bunch of young freshman women drinking more than they've ever had in their life, and they're wandering around your house. And, I remember me and the officers being very consciously committed to watching out for that. Like, if we saw anybody going upstairs we didn't think should be going upstairs, we would stop it. If we heard anything was getting a little, I remember incidents of brothers going into people's rooms and saying, she needs to go home, and making sure she got home. One thing I liked about the drinking age being younger in those days is that there was a socialization of how to cope with this stuff. And, older people would help younger people learn to do that responsibly. And I just remember lots of nights making sure people got home. And I think that's healthy before, at an earlier age than we do now, unfortunately. So yeah, I do remember it. And I do remember I don't quite remember, but I remember some things off campus that I think rattled people. But I had a good impression within my little bubble of how that was unfolding.
Sure. It sounds like these are conversations you were having, and that you were being proactive to try and prevent
well,
this.
And I think I'll credit our national fraternity, which at the time was quite stern about these things. There was no, at least in our fraternity, there was no sense of permissiveness about that kind of stuff. So maybe we were lucky, maybe we were good, I don't know, but I think we avoided some things that could have been worse, for whatever reason. Yeah.
Thank you for answering that. I wanted to backtrack a little bit because you were mentioning Sam Sadler and also being able to grow close with the president, being a president's aide, and work in these circles and interact with these administrative individuals. Did you look to any of those individuals as mentors, or were there other mentors you had during your time at William & Mary that you could point to?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I am one of a trillion people who would say Sam Sadler was a mentor because Sam Sadler is a mensch. He's one of those rare individuals who not only feel it's their duty and their responsibility, but take special joy, pleasure, and passion in the development of young people. And I remember him always being surprisingly available to people. He was someone you could feel very, very comfortable going in. He always had a sense of humor, which I think, no matter what people say, administrators can be an intimidating relationship to develop. Sam made that very easy. So I remember even when our fraternity would be doing something it probably shouldn't have been doing. I can remember days of Sam Sadler showing up on Saturday morning and go, so, what cleaning is going up on? I was like, but he could do it in a way that let you know he knows, and you better be, without it becoming just, a combative thing. We felt like he knew how to become one of you, without being subverted by you. So you didn't want to disappoint him, and I think he was a great mentor. I had great military mentors because I spent a lot of time in ROTC. So the professors of military science, I remember in the young, I think about them, they would have been young officers, but they seem old to me, who were working in the department, I think were very important. I really did enjoy the transition from Tom Graves to Paul Verkyle, so I got to know them in that capacity. So yeah, I had good mentors. I think I have one regret, which is I never powerfully developed mentorship with faculty. Mm-hmm. Something I see students do a lot more today than they did at my time. Going to class in the 80s felt a little more like you just go to work and you come home. And when you're home, you're home. You don't sort of go, yeah, some students always have and always do, but most of us would just, I got to go to class, I got to go to the office, and then when you're done with the office, you're done. I think I went about college that way. There were a few professors that Joel Schwartz in the government department who's still around and who I took more than once because I was really sort of moved by their class and had a bit more of a relationship, but not as much as I should have. I wish I had academic mentors today, more of them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did you ever come into contact or work with Dean Carroll Hardy at all?
Yes, I did. Be honest with you, a little more because of my sister. My sister Linda was an English theater major. So she really kind of got under the wing of Dr. Hardy. And in many ways, I got to know her because of my sister. I just remember her just being kind of this giant of a figure. She just commanded a kind of grace and authority. An exemplar is the word I would use. There was something about her that was gravitational. Like, you quietly felt both the obligation as an African American student, to what she was making available to you, and also just a degree of comfort that there were folks like her who took an interest in folks like us. And I remember that really well. My sister Linda's always loved her, and she's a Broadway actress to this day as a consequence of that impact. So I think that's how I remember her.
Sure. And I think it kind of leads into somewhere I wanted to go, which was to ask you what the experience of being an African American at William & Mary during the 1980s was like.
Yeah, I knew you would ask this question, and I want to answer it honestly without seeming to dismiss the concerns that other students obviously would have had. My experience was fantastic. I never experienced a racist encounter, not once, in 4 years that I have any memory of. Well, I should take that back. I'll tell you one, but it was more humor. It was, we coped with it differently than we might today. Um, uh, I felt extremely welcomed by my fellow students, by faculty. I just never had any perception that that was a significant issue. And the percentages were much lower than they are today by a lot. At the same time, there was a budding Black life culture going on at the campus, but probably much less than today. These things were more new, Black sororities and fraternities, service-oriented stuff, you know, and I participated in that as well. So, you know, it wasn't like I sort of checked out from what that was about and was over here, but, you know, would go to dances that were sort of oriented around that, had made a number of friends who were in Black sororities or fraternities and sort of experienced that through them. Although I was, you know, the vast majority of fraternities and sororities at William & Mary were largely white, and, you know, all of them seemed relatively welcoming, people of every type from my experience. So I don't have a bad racial experience, and I don't remember a lot of that being a very conscious set of fears and anxieties. Though, as time passed, some of my friends there who came from a different background or had different campus experiences than me have helped me see that they were less happy there than I thought they were. Now, I think back then you put on a good face. I think what's more transparent today is I think we talk about when people are uncomfortable. And I think back then, I think a lot of those students had a stiff upper lip, and you know, they're not the kids of the 60s integrating places, but I think they'd still been raised by those parents, and I think you were supposed to march on. And you know, but knowing many of them as well as I do even to this day, you know, I think they didn't feel as warmly as I did that this was their alma mater, this was their experience. It seemed a little more vocational, like they did what they were supposed to do and got out. So I think that's interesting, because I think it was not so much, those tensions weren't there. I think they were subverted more than they are today.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned you just had the one experience that was more humorous?
In fraternity life, in sports life, you'd see some, you know, there's one fraternity who would sort of march through campus wearing Confederate uniforms, and I remember them marching under our freshman dorm, which none of us took kindly to, but our response was to fill trash cans with water and pour it on them. So that's how we dealt with it, which we did do. Me and my roommate poured a huge...
Excellent.
You know, and I think, look, we weren't experts on this stuff, but I think we learned how to somehow express what was inappropriate and be engaged in that without completely going to sides. Like, you know, some of these guys were certainly more Southern and had different perspectives than I do, but I rarely found time there would be somebody I would avoid or wouldn't confront or talk to or spend time with. You know, even if I did understand, they thought about something differently than I did.
Great. That's very insightful. I'm wondering, because the percentages were significantly different, that even though your experience was not a negative one, if it was a noticeable thing, like it was noticeable that there is a drastic demographic difference, it's noticeable that I believe you were one of 5 African Americans or students of color in your fraternity.
No.
But was this something that there was an awareness of this, or it was just, that was what it was?
Yeah, you know, hindsight, was there awareness? Sure. You have to understand that, you know, a lot has to do with where you come from. And, you know, I came from Army life. I was always one of a few. You know, we didn't live in a predominantly black community anywhere ever, other than passing through. You know, we lived on Army bases, which there's an element of that are relatively brutally egalitarian, right? I mean, you know, the hierarchy on a military post is by rank more than it is by anything else. And, you know, in our case, my father was, one, both an officer, be a very successful, fast climbing officer, and so a lot of times I'm posed, you were a colonel's kid, or it didn't matter. It seemed secondary, some of those things, and I actually think the military as an institution has been much farther along on racial issues and issues like this than society as a whole. The military had been integrated since '48. Many of its senior people were increasingly visible in those roles. The soldier corps is run by, at the time, certainly by African American non-commissioned officers. So, we had a long tradition of African Americans in senior posts with much authority over black and white. And so I came out of a world where me and my sisters were, most streets we were the only ones. The colonels live here, but the Powells are black, but they're the only, So to me, the perception of the percentages didn't feel out of place to me. Those were the percentages of the life I lived in. When I talked to friends who had more issues, their life was different that way. They were used to much bigger proportions of their racial community, and they had a deeper part of their cultural interests and loves that were tied up in that then you come into a place where you've gone from being 30, 40, 50, sometimes more like 70, 80 to 4 and 5. That's a much more radical shift for that student. And so I don't like when people talk about these racial things or any other, or gender in kind of generalized ways, because I think sometimes things can be very particularized based on the prior experience of that student. I knew it wasn't many. That was relatively obvious. But in some sense, I think that was still early enough where there was a little bit of a source of pride, right? Among a lot of my black friends, we were William Mary's black kids. And we took that as something good for us, that we were part of what they were trying to change. And so that's it's a different time, but I actually think those issues get harder as you get bigger numbers. I think if you're 30%, then the range of subjects gets much more complex and serious. So success breeds new challenges. And I think the integration of numbers has been very successful, but now you have to really work harder on inclusion and not just representation. And, I think you have a higher population to be more culturally sensitive to. Success often makes things even more challenging.
Sure. And sort of along the same vein, but you're speaking of it as like a source of pride. And speaking of sources of pride, you were the first black commander of the ROTC at William and Mary.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
You were, and now that we're kind of preparing to celebrate 50 years of African Americans in residence at William and Mary, we're looking back on a lot of these firsts, and you were in fact the first there. What was the experience of being a commander of the ROTC like? And being the first black commander of the ROTC was certainly a source of pride, I imagine.
Well, when they called me and said, junior summer going into senior year, that you'd been selected to be the commander of the Corps Cadets, I guess we called it then, it's probably, other than being admitted to William & Mary itself, it probably was the most moving, emotionally successful thing I achieved the whole time I was there. I mean, I was thrilled when I got elected president of Theta Delta Chi. I was honored and touched to be a president's aide. That probably meant a lot to me. But to be told, you're going to be the one, and you get to, and I probably quietly aspired to that since day one. I mean, I really wanted to do that someday, and worked hard to try to make that happen. I had a father who'd been a commander. I'd seen command, so I really wanted to experience the same thing. So for me, it really melted my heart. I mean, I was so thrilled and excited. And I think it also crystallized for me that there's a skill set and there's a culture and there's a human dynamic to what it means to be a leader. You know, I remember giving a speech to high school kids at William & Mary years later, and Taylor Reevely was president. He was introducing me. I was the high school model United Nations, I think. And I just agreed to run down and do it. I was happy to help, but it turned out to be a big group. I didn't know. And Taylor got up to introduce me, said a few nice things, as only Taylor Reevely can say them. He says, I would just say, you know, Michael's done a lot of things, but he just is a leader, you know. And I remember getting a little chill when he said it, because I remember having that conclusion at William & Mary Corps Cadets that that's what you should be doing. And it's not, it kind of can be a career. It's, you know, motivating people to do things is a good skill. And then that's when the rest of William & Mary started making sense to me. I mean, I think if you think about a liberal arts education and you think about what they're teaching you, and you try to assemble that into a coherent philosophy about leadership, it's amazing how much all of a sudden all those pieces come together. I mean, why you have to have a wide range of knowledge in order to be creative, why creativity is important to leadership, why discipline, hard work, how to motivate human beings. I mean, there's so much. I could write a whole book on, you know, just why the right kind of college education goes into, and I think that's why there's so many leaders that get produced from liberal arts schools. I mean, I think William & Mary's tradition, they like to brag about it, but I don't think that's an accident that leaders come from that place.
And you were a leader and you came from the place.
Well, we'll see. Story's not over.
So before we jump to trajectory after William & Mary, because it already sounds like it was impactful for you and it kind of determined what direction you went in after you left. I just want to know some of your favorite memories from your time at William & Mary, if you could narrow it down to just a couple.
That I'm allowed to put on tape? I don't know.
Yep.
You know, I would start by saying, I don't know why that first week before classes started was just surreal and magical. All of a sudden you're a grown-up, you know, you're not going home to your house at night, you're going to your dorm, and you know, you sort of have this, you know, this elation that you're on your own in a way you've never been before. You know, I met my wife and was totally like freaked out by her right away. So she's around, you know, being stimulated about your classes and what you're about to study. You know, you suddenly, you know, think you're not a school kid anymore and you're doing algebra 2 or whatever, but you get to really do what grown-up people study. I thought that, you know, I remember being very, so to me, there's this, and the weather was spectacular. I remember not overly hot like it sometimes is, but sunny, and it's just, there's just this kind of magical first week. You know, you mentioned, you know, the day you got picked to be the commander of the Corps Cadets was a very, very special memory. You know, there are a number of very special parties, which I'm not going to tell you about, that really will always remember, just because you're having so much fun with your contemporaries, and we're just laughing, and I just remember that being spectacular. Me and my wife being at this toga party at Barrett, I remember, well, she'll tell you the same thing, we'll always remember it. I remember quiet moments too. I used to like to walk around the campus. I'm a bit of a meditative person, and I would sometimes be down along the creek or walking past the statue of the couple that sits at the end of Grimdale, or you know, I used to have little spots around the campus I used to like to just go to be alone. I remember that. I'll never forget a big snowstorm in which I'm convinced the entire campus was in the snowball fight, and I remember the campus police pulled in between DuPont and Yates, you know, purportedly to stop this. There was only one guy in the car, and there were like 300 people over here and 300 people over here, and almost on cue, you know, everything launched. I remember that being a great act of defiance that was fun. And I remember a few, I guess I would say, I remember, you know, occasional academic moments of clarity that, you know, when you finally kind of, something makes an impression on you. I could probably name a million, but
Does sound like they struck something, whether a sense, it's or sensory or something else, but those have stuck with you all this time.
Yeah. I think I could be wrong, but, I'm a student of this today because it's my business, but we didn't have any cell phones, and computers were brand new. We had a computer lab. My dad actually bought me a PC to go to college with, which he's so cheap, I couldn't believe he did it. But he believed that this was the future in 1981. And so I got a computer for graduation, a personal computer. And I didn't know anybody else in the entire William & Mary campus that had one. People would come to my room to see it. And I had a printer and everything, and I could do my papers. And people were like, Powell's got a computer, you gotta go see this thing. And I mean, it was, by the time I'm a senior, these things are proliferating. But you had to, the point of this is, we had to really be present. There was no, you could only be distracted by other human beings. We didn't, even your mother, you talked to her once a month. Some people talk to her once a week. We didn't. The phone rang once every blue moon. So you had to just engage with each other, I think, in a deeper, richer way. Maybe today people would say they're fine with the way they do it, but if you were bored, you wandered out of the door and went outside to see what was going on. You didn't pick up a device. You couldn't. So the number of times somebody would just bang on your door, hey, we're bored, we're going here to do, there were so many of those kind of sporadic, unplanned, unstructured, human contact kind of things that I just remember thinking were so much fun. And if somebody wanted to find you, they had to come find you. And they had to literally I don't know, I think I saw him over there at the CAF, right? So people would tranche across the campus to find you because you couldn't text you or call you. God, I sound so old now, but it was special for that reason. I have a much stronger sense of being physically out on the campus a lot than I do even today when because, I can text someone, oh, Jane, meet me back here. I don't have to go. But we were always out all over the place, navigating our lives. It was cool.
Different world.
It's a different world. It's a very different world.
But yeah, I can certainly see the value in that. Absolutely. Even now, it's just so nice to unplug and just take a walk around Sunken Garden.
Yeah, and just let it burn in your memory. It's just a little different.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I do want to get to post-William & Mary, but when you mentioned you met your would-be wife the week of going to William & Mary, did you both start a relationship soon after that, or was this something, a pining that eventually resulted in something? It just seems to be...
It started immediately. So it started within 4 days.
Oh.
Although, she was one of those classic sappy freshmen who came with a boyfriend who was off somewhere else, and, pictures all over her room with, whatever that poster was that it said, if you love something, let it go, that every freshman, listening to Best of Bread albums, longing for her boyfriend, So it was kind of one of those things where we found each other, and he didn't last very long. And I remember being really scared once because he surprised her. He showed up freshman year, on the hall, and we were like, uh-oh. But that was the end of that. And I think we dated for 2 years. We stopped. We stayed best friends. So when we graduated, we were not dating. And she actually was very seriously dating somebody else who was older. And I went off to Germany with no expectation that we were anything. And really the fates forced me back in her direction when I had to leave Germany when I got hurt. So, it's just funny how life works that way.
Yeah, it's just so interesting talking to so many William & Mary alum who found the person that they would
More
end
than
up
most
with.
schools, I talked, the
really
number of
is.
people I know who both met each other. I talk to people at other schools, it doesn't seem to be nearly as contagious.
No. I can't speak
I don't
on
know
that
why.
directly, but yeah, just something in the William & Mary water, I guess.
I guess.
don't know.
I guess.
So, you brought up Germany, and it's a good transition into time after William & Mary. How did William & Mary and your time there just really determine the trajectory you took after you left?
Well, some of it does, some of it doesn't. The way I think about it is, your experience and your education sort of walk alongside you all the time. It's always sort of off your shoulder. If you're listening for insight and recollection, and but I was in some ways on a very mechanical path, right? Meaning, I went to ROTC, you get commissioned, I got commissioned, I got the branch that I was supposed to be in. You waited for the Army to tell you where to go. I went where they told me where to go. And, after some training and some detours, the first way I would say that it affected me was when I went to Armor Officer Basic Course. Everybody goes to their first 6-month school when they get their branch, and I was a tank officer, so that's where I went, Fort Knox, Kentucky. And I really had no planned effort, like how to, you just want to do well. You don't really. And in the last few weeks, I started being told, right now, your scores are, you're like in first place in this class. And that's when I realized I was a better student than I thought I was, because all of my academic work had been inside of William & Mary, where I was an average student. Nothing spectacular at all, right? But I remember, because when I got dropped off at William & Mary, my dad said, one of the most important things is you're just here to learn how to learn. And that's probably the most important thing, more than any knowledge. Oh, okay. But when I was at Fort Knox, I was like, oh, I actually know how to learn. Like, I know how to break this down and figure it out. And, some tasks were very academic, some tasks were very physical. But the point was, it all came together. And I graduated first in my class, which really surprised me, and sort of put me on a different path in the Army than I would have been. So, right from the beginning, I think some academic ability put you in a position to take a certain. And because I was first, I could pick what duty station I wanted to go to, what unit I wanted to be in. I got to go where I wanted to go, and I switched from where I had been assigned to this other unit in Germany, and off I went. I don't know if anything prepared me for those first few years. It's a surreal life. We were in a pretty remote part of Germany. We're not in one of these big American ghettos, so I really lived in German economy and lived in the woods a lot. But again, I think, certainly, scholarly temperament. I think a lot of the impressions that I made that were to my benefit were about being creative. That theater arts major stuff will stay with you all day long when it's time to figure out how to present something or be more creative about it. And I think William & Mary contributed to my temperament. I think I was a sort of more happy, joyful kind of person. I think William & Mary was producing those kinds of people that carried over. At least that's the first stretch. I also think that when I got hurt badly, which we could talk about, but your life is badly disrupted. Everything you thought you were going to do, years of training and investment just got flushed down the drain. And I think coming back from adversity or learning how to adapt and cope and redirect, I couldn't say exactly how I would draw the causation, but I think William & Mary had something to do with, right? Because you have to keep your mind active when your body's broken. And, I was in a bed for 4 or 5 months. And, what do? You have to read and you have to think and you have to plot a new future because they're telling you your career is over. We're going to kick you out of the service for physical disability. And you're like, that's a lot of mental work. That's a lot of internal work of the mind. And, you have to believe that anything that helped shape your mind was playing a role. I don't know. I could go through years of this, but I rediscovered being in love with learning, I think, much older. And I would say in my mid-40s and 50s, I kind of became an academic again. Like, I law school, first of all, you know, I probably couldn't have gotten through without a Women's education, but the rigors and the joys of learning became stronger the older I got.
Great.
And I'm always trying to figure something out today that not directly related, you know. Lifelong learning, you know, they talk about it, but I think in your 30s you're so busy, 40s you're busy, you know, you're just kind of buzzing through. You don't have a lot of time for sort of Aristotle-like luxurious reflection on questions, but then you start to. And then as you get to more midlife, you know, what's the meaning of all of this? You know, I'm halfway done. Maybe, you know. And all of a sudden that, you know, philosophers matter to you. All of a sudden great literature has more to say than you understood when you were 20. And then when you're 48 or 50, you're like, oh my God, this guy, you know, Tolstoy's right, you know? So it's amazing that you can pick up where they kind of lit the fire.
Well, that's excellent. And even following adversity, as you say, just being able to pick up and head in a new direction again. I mean, the time you spent being able to think and being able to reflect and to get through that and then to choose what's next. I mean, how did you choose what was next? How did you?
You know, some of it you stumble into, you know, got out of the hospital, I didn't have my career, I had to start over, and, you know, through a friend, parental friend, you know, well, why don't you come work at the Pentagon for so-and-so, and, you know, he can teach you how to do, you know, sounds good. Like so many kids today, grabbing into, you know, who knows how it's going to affect you. But I had always thought about law school even when I was younger, so all of a sudden something I had kind of waved off started resurfacing prominently. So I worked at the Pentagon for like 2 years and then decided to go back to school, you know, and I was already married and I already had a 1-year-old, so I had to do it under those circumstances, but you know, so that was my choice. But I don't know how to put this. It's not what you do or what happens to come along your way. It really is just the mindset of adaptation. Like the struggles really aren't what job do you have today. It's more like, you know, how do you really think through what it means to start fresh, and what do you want out of life and what you don't want out of life, and, you know, in some ways it gave you a chance to not be on autopilot about that, which I think a lot of people start to get. You know, I'm just on autopilot. This happens, and now I do this, and now I do that, and now I do that. But, you know, you're forced to say, well, so much for that idea, now what? I'm glad I went to law school older. You know, I was 26, not 22. I think the maturity of where I was in life was better for me. I think it would be better for more students. You know, when I teach kids in college classes or law school, I say, you know, most of life is about adaptation. It's not about knowledge or pre-planning. I mean, there's no plan that survives the first contact with the enemy. We used to say in the Army, there's no sports team whose game plan, the minute you get out there, doesn't have to be radically adjusted. It's the talented people are the adjusters, you know, who see the cracks and say, we have to shift, we have to make a change. You know, you watch a football team lose all day long because at halftime they can't figure out what to change. The greatest teams, you know, very quickly figure out this isn't working, we got to change. They change it. And that takes some courage, it takes innovation, it takes situational awareness. And again, that takes me back to liberal arts. I think people who have a wider range of knowledge and experiences figure that stuff out faster.
That's an excellent philosophy, just a way of looking at things, and I would say being able to roll with the punches can get you a long way.
You know, most of the hottest jobs in America today didn't exist 5 years ago. I mean, so when I talk to a student about, I should definitely go study this because that's I'm like, really? How do you know? First of all, by the time you're done in 4 years, I guarantee the job market won't be exactly the same. So this sort of narrow approach to careerism, on the margins has some virtue, but against an economy that dynamically convulses in the way that ours does, it's pretty crazy to try to tell somebody, 10 years from now, these will be the jobs. My approach to that is, instead of trying to tell you what the end of the play is, let me just teach you to be a good actor. And, you'll play in whatever the show is, right? Or you'll spell whatever the words are that are, be a learner and an adapter and someone with perseverance, and let the rest take care of itself.
That's great. So before we wrap up, I want to kind of bring this back to William & Mary, because you didn't graduate and then just leave indefinitely. You got back involved. So what led you to get involved with William & Mary again, and what has that looked like for you? What different roles have you had?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I would have, but for it sort of knocking on your door, I remember somewhere in the 90s, somebody coming to my office talking about, let's get, probably a development person. They're often the people who find people who've been apart. And the suggestion was made, we'd love to get you involved in something. And I said, I'd be open to that. Sounds kind of interesting. This is usually how it works at William & Mary. And next thing I know, they asked me to be on what was then called the endowment board, which today I think we call the foundation board, which I'm on again. And so I got a taste, and that was interesting. But the real moment came when it was Charter Day, and I have no idea why, but the college asked if I would be the Charter Day speaker, which meant a lot to me. I thought that was a special speech to give. I worked on it really hard. It also happened, life's a lot of coincidences, right? It also happened to be the first Charter Day after the governor's election. And so William & Mary's tradition is the governor always comes to Charter Day, in February after he's been elected, or she's been elected in November. And so Mark Warner was there. And I got to give my speech with the governor sitting here. And very quickly after that, that turned into the governor wants to put you on the Board of Visitors, which I did. So now I'm pretty deep into governance. And because William & Mary taught me about leadership, I tend to gravitate toward, what can I do to help? Next thing you know, you're the secretary and you're vice rector. And then I got elected rector, which I was thrilled about and loved very deeply. But it was that experience that taught me the other side of this school, the part that I experienced on the retail side as a consumer, and the back office operations are sort of breathtakingly integrated, in the sense that the values and the commitment and the passion on the back end matches that on the front end. And if I could explain to students how brilliantly well run that institution is for how little resources it has, it's an amazing achievement, and one that many people have contributed to over a long period of time. But I took a lot of pride in saying, I think I went from being involved to saying, you should be committed to being a steward, right? Like, as long as you take breath, this place is not going to fail. And I came to it at a younger age, being involved with the school that way, but caught that bug and never lost it. And, I think also when you get a little bit older, I'm only in my young 50s, but you start to want to be a citizen of your community. You don't just want to have your job. You want to feel like you're involved in a philanthropy that matters. You're involved with young people in a way that matters, that you're more interesting and more Renaissance than that, right? And I think one of the best things that one would add to their Christmas tree of life is to be committed to one's alma mater, assuming that's a value to you. So I can't think of hardly anything better to be doing with extracurricular time than stewarding, 300 plus years of historical significance. And, and I also am a believer that everything is fragile and changing. You know, I'm a Buddhist in that regard, right? There is no permanence. And the day we forget that it takes hard work, care, love, and stewardship, William and Mary could die. Anything can die. And I think at times in some of the communities there's been a belief, oh, you know, it's been there 300 years, it's not going anywhere. No, it has at times been inches from falling into the sea. And doesn't look like that today, probably not going to look like that in my lifetime, but stuff we do today, you know, in 2080, you know, in 3010, you know, are going to be outgrowths of what we do today. So that's stewardship. So I want to be a steward.
Sure. And that's actually quite inspiring to hear you talk about it like that. And I know it hasn't been without difficulty, and what I assume any stewardship role will have controversies and difficulties, and you experienced that a little bit during your time as rector. So if we can touch on that just a little bit, just how the experience was for you to experience the controversy that came out of Gene Nickel resigning from the school and the fallout from that.
Sure. No, I was not fortunate enough to have a ceremonial rectorship. It turned into being a intense full-time job. I probably, at the height of it, was spending 30, 40 hours a week on William and Mary. And it was intense but really important. You know, I'm blessed to say that I was on both ends of that saga. I was on the board that hired Gene Nickel, and I was on the board that lost faith in him. And you know, people tend to forget that it was quite a journey for everyone involved, because it began. I'll never forget the vote, and you know, when you pick a president, you do it in the ceremonial boardroom in Wren, and with candles, and you know, you open the balcony and you ring the bell, and it's a moment of hope and optimism. And you know, he had our full faith and confidence, and you know, but one of the things we often talked about in making that choice was it felt high risk, high reward. Like, it's not a traditional choice, but it could have a really high upside. Might not, but the school needs to be bolder and take greater risks. And we did. And I actually think, you know, Gene is an incredibly fine person. As a human being, I like him a lot. But we started having problems, I think, earlier than people realize. And they were not the problems that were visibly manifested. Or certainly you know, he moved the cross off the Wren Chapel, which was highly controversial. That in and of itself wasn't the issue. The issue was sort of how and why that decision was made, what the process of that decision was, what the inclusion of other people who have a stake in the value trade-offs that you're making. This is a place of shared governance. You know, this is a place with a lot of history, particularly an alumni, and you know, you're certainly free to raise the prospect of making changes like school, but it's sort of like, but it's not your school. It doesn't belong to you alone with your values. It belongs to all of us, and it requires and that was a skirmish, really. That had nothing. That wasn't going to lead to him leaving. But over the course of a couple of years and a lot of very hard work to fix the situation, we brought in outside people and 360-degree reviews and offered to have executive coaches. That presidency is a very complex, very hard job. And you know, somebody can be great and popular, and they just don't want to do the harder, grudgier things. That school couldn't afford to have a period with no great fundraiser in the seat. Couldn't afford to have somebody who, you know, had a lot of very admirable values, but wanted to almost be a student at times, going out to physically get into the controversy. I don't know that I think that's the role of a president. So, you know, it just really wasn't working. And it was a very, very hard, painful decision. I could also write volumes about all that went into trying to figure out what to do. But at the end of the day, I remember you talk about mentors. I had a great mentor, not a William Mary mentor, but she was a mentor through another leadership program I was in at the Aspen Institute. Ann Korologis, who was a Secretary of Labor once. She's probably one of my best mentors. And I remember calling her for advice, as well as Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the chancellor at the time, and others. And almost all of them said something that was a variant of the same thing, which is, there are no indispensable people. William Mary's been there a long time. It'll be there a long time after, but the institution has to be bigger than any one person. And if you can't get him to accept that, or that, then you have a problem. But more importantly, don't be afraid to make the change, no matter how painful it'll be in the short term, because you have to believe the institution's bigger than any one human being. And I thought that was really powerful. And at the end of the day, in a very emotional board meeting, people almost teary went through this. And they said, we just don't believe the long-term interests of the college are going to be served on this course and speed, and we don't think we can change it. And I think probably the most painful thing I've ever done in my professional life is to show up at his house on a Sunday morning to tell him we were done. And I'll hate that day forever. I don't like firing people anyway, and and it was unfortunate because, there was so much promise in this choice, but it just wasn't going to work anymore. And then it turned into being, kind of explosive and controversial. I will try to avoid being a critic of how the rollout was done and how aspects of it were intended to be purposefully inflammatory. And but we did it, and maybe the second most difficult thing I've ever done is we called up and said, look, I will come down there and we'll sit in chairs for all day long. So we set up a huge town hall in 3 segments: students, faculty, and staff. And me and about 7 board members agreed to sit there and answer every question till we're done. And I think I sat in that chair for 9.5, 10 hours. And we did the students for 2 hours, 3 hours, the faculty for 2 or 3 hours, the staff for 2 or 3 hours. And I think that was the day the healing started, because number one, in the tradition of William Mary, we were explaining, we were transparent, we were letting people speak their piece, even people we didn't agree with, and even people didn't agree with us. And I think when a lot of people walked away, they said whether you agree with the choice or not, they made it thoughtfully and with some rigor. Frankly, it was the students who really first led the healing. I mean, the Flathead did brilliant editorial work around this and said, they surprised the campus and came out and said, we've studied all this stuff. We actually think the board made the right decision, which people didn't expect. And then I got to lean back and see, I got to hire Taylor Reevely. It's the best professional decision I've ever made. I went to his house. I said, you're not going to want to see me, but we have a situation. And are you prepared to step in on short notice? Are you sure? To his credit, he was very aggressive with me and saying, are you guys sure you're making the right decision? And, and I don't know if I want to. I said, think about it. He thought about it this long, and he said, my loyalty to the college, if you need me, I'll be there. So he walked in with no notice, no prep. I think the rest is history. I mean, the way the college has prospered in the interim makes me feel good, in the sense that I don't know if this is where we would have been if we hadn't done that painful thing. So I'm hesitant to say I'm proud of the decision, because those are painful moments you don't ever want to take joy in. But I do believe stronger than ever we made the right decision. And I think we put William Mary on a much better path. And I also think the experience of Gene taught us to be bolder, like he was. I mean, he did leave his mark. I think he left his mark in people willing to strive for more greater, more envelope pushing, whether it's Matt Lambert and Taylor, who's for the Bold campaign. I don't think we necessarily would have been that ambitious or that aggressive but for going through a period which tested our mettle in that regard. So I think everybody leaves their mark. I think he left his mark. I think, certainly there were negative things, but there were positive things that we should be thankful to him for. But I don't think he was going to have a successful tenure if he had stayed.
Thank you for diving into
Yeah.
that conversation with me. I know,
Well, it's oral history. We better get it all
It
out.
is. We have to get the history, and it sounds like it was quite the roller coaster, but it also sounds like it didn't necessarily push you away from your involvement.
No,
But
the funny thing about your question is I think I needed a break, but it didn't push me away because it deepened the love for the school. It deepened, it would have been a lot easier, to be perfectly honest, that, look, I'm just an alum. I don't need to be in the middle of this mess. I don't, school hired him. It's not my, you could have painted over it very easily and just kind of gone along and let it. But I think it was the passion and love for the institution and its future that motivated everybody. So when you emerged from it, you almost emerged more affirmed and more committed. And if it weren't for the maturity and the grace of the campuses evolving from it, that's when I said, this place is, it didn't continue to linger as this hideously bitter thing. And, yes, some people never were happy about the choice, but the school moved on in a very graceful way that just shows that this whole point that Anne, my mentor, was saying was right. It's bigger than any person.
And it sounds like, I don't know, it's just groups of people, for better or for worse, banded together during this point to make their voices heard, to come and sit down and ask questions of you and BOV members and just talk through something that was highly controversial and that looked like it could be a true hurdle for the college to get through. And from your description, it sounds like this was handled in such a way that, people are allowed to express.
Look, I'll put it this way. A few years ago, UVA had their own version of this. And some of us watched with smirks on our face, humored by how badly it went at UVA versus how much better William Mary got through the same thing. UVA tried to fire a college president, the board, it wasn't well. I don't know all the details, but the point was it exploded. A lot of mistakes were made, not the school's finest hour. And I think the contrast is pretty amazing. The William Mary community was exceptionally mature. And yeah, nobody wants to sit for 9 hours, but the questions were rigorous, thoughtful, hard, relatively civilly presented, every now and then less so, but to be expected. And people were persuadable. I mean, I work in Washington. Sometimes my frustration is, sometimes it feels like it doesn't matter how good your argument is, it doesn't matter how right your position is. There are times you just feel like you still can't win. What we felt was the William Mary community is still intellectually centered and capable of being persuaded if you have the weight of the argument. And it was very reaffirming to see that most people it was persuadable. And I think most people who were involved then, who now see it, would say, "Ooh, this was right. We can see we were hoping this would be the case. It turns out it was the case." It's good.
Well, so clearly it has not prevented you from staying involved with the college, because you still are. Would you just explain the ways in which you still are involved with the college?
In whatever, sitting here, in whatever way they ask me, my wife loves it too. My military family moved all over the place, has few things in common, but this is one of the anchors, given that all my sisters went here too. My wife's sister also went to William Mary. It's part of our anchor. So formally I'm on the endowment board. I'm on the Washington Regional Fundraising Committee structure. But more importantly, I'm on the phone, on the other end of the phone. And it doesn't take much for them to call and say, we could use this or that, or would you speak here, or meet this student? Yes, and more yes. So, every summer, the whole William Mary Summer program comes over here for a couple of hours, and I get to talk and dialogue with them. And whenever I do that, at least 5 students will reach back out and say, can I come over and talk? So 3 or 4 of them have been here already. And, they ask all kinds of great questions, and I ask them great questions, and they say, well, how should I do that? And I spend days sending them books and podcasts and contacts to try to get them going. So to me, the happiest thing to be involved with is be involved with the students.
I think I need to be on this list of
You should be
getting
on
the
this list.
podcasts.
Oh yeah, I'm a
Some of
podcast
those.
freak.
I think
love
I read
podcasts.
something somewhere, Malcolm Gladwell's
Revisionist history. It's fantastic. I've done the whole thing.
Good.
Because he's my cousin, supposedly.
Really?
Well, he claims to be. We haven't figured this out yet. But if you look at the back of, I don't know which book, Outliers maybe, he talks about how he's Colin Powell's Jamaican relative. My dad's convinced it's actually true, so there must be some. I've never met him, but.
Sounds like it's time for you to do a podcast together, maybe?
His
And
podcast is
all
brilliant.
this. Great.
And there's 3 in that series he does on higher ed that's amazing.
Yes, I don't think I've gotten through all of them, but I certainly
They're toward
love-
the end, like
Yeah, I haven't done.
the last 3 or 4.
But I will. I'm motivated to. And then I'll get on that podcast list for the other podcasts you send out, and I'll just
Lifelong learning.
I'll just be set. That's right. So just a couple more and we will wrap it up here. Again, thank you for answering all of these questions. So we're about to kick off the celebration for 50 years of African Americans in residence at William Mary. And I want to hear from you what you view as the value of diversity in general and on a college campus.
It's it's so important but so hard to articulate, and I think there's sort of so many kind of trite mechanical explanations about the value and virtues of diversity, but in some ways it's sort of coterminous with the values of liberal arts, right? That you will have a deeper, richer intellectual experience and human and emotional experience if that experience or that intellectual work or that inner work is done through multiple lenses, right? So academically we believe that knowing how to see the world through math has certain virtues, knowing how to see the world through literature has certain virtues, knowing how to see the world through religion has something to contribute to the historical dialogue that takes place across the ages. Or we wouldn't be teaching all of those things. And more importantly, we wouldn't in our academic environment require students to study all of those things, right? We don't let you self-select. Why? Because we believe you looking at the world through different lenses is what is the thing that makes you better. And just like sometimes people can't articulate very well why liberal arts is still valuable, that it's something like that. I think the same thing is true of human interaction. Knowing people of other experiences is just another way of having another lens on the world. And the greatest quality of human beings is we have mirror neurons, right? I mean, if you start crying, I'll get sad, right? If you smile, I'll be happier. If you yawn, I'm going to yawn. And so if you just know that basic fact, right, then sort of whose smiles are you reflecting? Whose eyes do you get to see through? Whose sadness might you digest? If that's a pretty narrow collection of people and experiences, then your training is narrower. You are not a worldly person. You're not a person with multiple windows on the world, which is, to me, William Mary's promise to you is we will send you out as that person. I don't know how we can send you out as that person if we don't also expose you to those people. So there's a very self-interested utilitarian version of utility, which is you don't want to live without it. You will be a lesser capable person if you haven't experienced more. It's not just moral, which it is, or philanthropic, which it can be. It's not even all about the other. It's about human capacity for betterment and growth and outlooks on the world. And I think my life would be trivially less without having had that. I lived all over the country. Do I want to live in Clarksville, Kentucky again? Not particularly. But did I learn things in Clarksville, Kentucky that give me a window on people who do and the country that I use today? Absolutely. There's no experience doesn't leave an impact on you. So part of me thinks that's one really important, part of the story. I think we don't talk about this enough in America, or we talk about it in too radicalized terms at times, but I think this country's still trying to make good on a sin. A sin that's darker and more bitter than most people want to look in the mirror and see. And I think slavery, and I think Jim Crow and the civil rights era, and I think what we see today in lingering vestiges of a brutal treatment of other human beings based simply on an immutable characteristic. I still think that there's an effort to redeem from that and to give more. This is more important for an institution of colonial heritage, right? Do the constitutional words mean what they say or they don't? Are we really repudiating that African Americans are not full people? And don't get me wrong, I think almost all the students that we marry would say yes to that question. But I also think they don't know what yes means, right? Like, yes, I believe in that conceptually. But we're still learning how to believe in it in a way that you live and walk and talk, right? Like that your behavior to other people, the way you interact, the opportunities you provide. This is why diversity increasingly is being talked about inclusion. So I could pour 20 more black kids in the school and say, we are diverse. But the second half of that is, but are we inclusive? That is, are we able to harness the best of all these experiences into something, and not thus there's a corner for them and a corner for you. And William Mary's not like that, but some schools are. So, I think the original sin of the U.S. Constitution is it talks so glowingly about the rights of human beings, and then is still trying to give life to those principles. And to me, so how can you be a true American and not believe in diversity? Is integral to the constitutional faith in the American experiment. So all these people who pull out their constitutions and talk about the country and America first, the greatest commitment of the American principle was a world of natural rights and human dignity, right? Even the whites of that day were chasing oppression, running from oppression and running from a societal treatment, right? So diversity to me is inherently American. And probably the hardest global experiment in the history of the world, a multicultural democracy, which is not easy. Democracies are easier if they're tribal, like everybody's the same, they think the same. They're much harder in our world. So if we're training leaders for America's future, and America is experimenting with multicultural democracy under these principles of inviolate human rights, all of our students should be practicing that every single day. When they go to eat lunch, when they go to class, when they get involved in experiments. If we really are preparing them for the 21st century, they have to have those experiences or their education is incomplete and their preparation for the real world is incomplete. So, I don't know, I could talk ramble trying to figure it out. I've always struggled with what the right definition of diversity is. I would say this, too often the definitions to me are too shallow. I'm always looking for a more resonant explanation of why it's important.
Well, that was great. Thank you. I love the way you described all of that. So, on that note, is there anything I haven't asked you or I haven't talked about or we haven't talked about that you would like to talk about on record? Or ask me?
I don't think so. You know, I would add, you know, you started off another point about race. You said, you know, we're about to celebrate the 50th anniversary. Celebrations are great, right? But 50 years is short. And I think I hope when we do this, we will be proud of our achievement, but we'll be more cognizant of how incomplete it really is. Even in the history of America, 50 years is nothing. I mean, I'm 54 years old, so you're telling me we're celebrating, you know, some of these periods are kind of short. I mean, even women, even in this country about to celebrate the 100th and the 19th Amendment. I mean, part of what strikes me when I hear about these commemorations is it's not really that long. And I think as we're learning right now, as the country seems convulsed over this stuff, a lot of people thought it was over. It was far from over. Far from over. And I think there's a healthy part of the harangue going on in America right now, because I think people are having to immerse themselves in their thinking and their philosophies and their beliefs. And I think the country is sort of going to have to rediscover and recommit to what it believes in. And so something good can come from all of this.
Actually, it made me want to bring up one more thing. I know I just said no more questions.
That's all right,
I lied
because I didn't have one more thing.
This idea that it has been a relatively short amount of time. We're about to celebrate 50 years of African Americans in residence, celebrate 100 years of co-education at school. So a lot has changed in that period of time, but in the great scheme of time, short period. So if we're looking out the next 50 years or the next 100 years, what are your hopes for William and Mary?
I hope it wins the perennial argument of the value of liberal arts. I hope that no matter what the robots in the CAF are like, or how much artificial intelligence is taken over the curriculum, that there are still books, and there are still people who want to do patient and long sustained deep thinking and study. I feel the world's getting shallower at a time where people need to be deeper. And I think we're being kind of trained to be shallow. And I think there's going to be a premium and a more desperate need for some institutions to sort of stand strongly, committedly against that tide. Not in opposition, certainly as a complement, but, but that still believes in the world is better off with people who know how to learn, are exposed to lots of great ideas, break open books, and spend uninterrupted periods of research and study in a quest to improve upon the human knowledge record or this life of society. My own belief is that technology will always be, to a degree, wondrous, but it's also going to do a lot of damage. And philosophers and sociologists and economists and religious scholars are going to have to remake sort of the post-tech world, right? And we see it now, what are the social norms evolving because of Twitter? What is the behavioral psychology around smartphone addiction? Will one day that be a will your smartphone be a controlled substance? I just think the world's crazy exciting because I think the industrial age is sort of collapsed into a new era and we all get to be at the beginning of it. So that means the next generation of all these thinkers got to figure this stuff out. But if they think they're going to figure it out without reading what the other guys said 100 years ago, they're making a big mistake, in my opinion.
Well, great. On that note, I have nothing else. Do you have anything else?
Nope.
No? Well, thank you so much for sitting
Thank you,
down with me and
guys. You
answering
guys are
all
the
my
best.
questions. This was